Hello, and a warm welcome to you at home this evening. I'm joining you live from the gallery in Cindy Mochizuki's Autumn Strawberry, an enchanting, poignant installation with multiple beautifully embedded animations. We are thrilled to have you join us through your screens, and I encourage you to come to the gallery to experience this exhibition, as well as its powerful pairing with Henry Tsang's Hastings Park. Art has the ability to share stories and ideas intergenerationally that are often at the same time troubling and inspiring, helping us to think deeply about our inheritances, revealing histories of injustices that continue to endure in shifted ways, awakening questions and responsibilities in our current context, and encouraging spaces for more conversations, memories, and better possibilities together. I continue to feel very privileged to serve as the director of the Surrey Art Gallery with an amazingly talented and dedicated staff. And that includes Cecily Nicholson, Alana Edwards, and Savi Baines, who will be working behind the scenes, or in this case, behind the camera for this program. Before we begin the conversations with Cindy and Henry, I would like to recognize that we are here in Bear Creek Park, where the salmon run in the fall, on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish peoples. So that includes the Katzie, Kwantlen, and Semiahmoo nations. The gallery as a team is committed to continually deepening our learning about the land and our work in relation to anti-racism and systemic change in all areas. So from exhibitions, collections, and education and engagement to labor and in all its forms. And now, I'm most pleased to welcome Jordan Strom, a long-standing and very skilled senior curator at the gallery, who will join you from Henry's Hastings Park.
Thank you very much, Alison. Welcome everyone to this evening's event. I'm so happy to be here hosting today. This conversation is organized on the occasion of two exhibitions, of course. We've got Cindy Mochizuki's Autumn Strawberry and Henry Tsang's Hastings Park, which is just behind me here. Both of these shows launched back in June 26th, and they will be running ongoing through the summer and open for viewing until August 28th. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging our community partners, the Powell Street Festival Society and the Nikkei National Museum and Cultural Center, whose programming this year is as tremendous as ever. We urge you to check out the Powell Street Festival's events and the Nikkei Museum's programming over the course of the next few weeks. Exhibitions and events are listed on their respective websites. These are challenging times for festivals and museums, and it is inspiring to see the work that they are doing and have been doing over the past many months. And they've really persevered and thrived, and it's very inspiring. I wanted to now just say that it is my genuine privilege to introduce tonight's two featured speakers. And they're joining us through the miracle of this technology that we've grown to know so well by video conference, and I wish they could be here on site. But I am so glad to see them without masks, and I feel we're intimately connected here by way of technology, so it's appropriate. Hi, you two. Thank you both for joining us, and we've been having these conversations over many months, and I'm looking forward to chatting more about these very important projects and how they relate to your other work. I guess I wanted to start with a little bit of background for those who are maybe less familiar with some of your achievements and your work. I'll start with you, Cindy. So Cindy's creates multimedia installations, audio fiction, performance, and animation, drawings, many mediums that she works in. Her works explore the manifestation of story and the relationship to site specificity, invisible histories and archives, memory work. She's exhibited and performed and screened her work across Canada, the United States, and other countries such as Australia and Japan. Recent exhibitions include group shows at the Vancouver Art Gallery, a solo at the Burrard Art Foundation, and the Richmond Art Gallery, and the Fry Art Museum, among others. And she has been a recipient of the Vancouver's Mayor's Award in New Media and Film in 2015, and the Jack and Doris Shadbolt Foundation for the Visual Arts Viva Award in 2020. So welcome, Cindy. And I will now just quickly introduce also Henry Tsang has created art projects that explore the spatial politics of history and language, community, food, cultural translation, and relationships to place for many years now. And these take the form of gallery exhibitions, many times in public spaces, on the street, pop-up street offerings, for example, 360 video walking tours and curated dinners, ephemeral and permanent public artworks, employing video, photography, and language and interactive media. Projects such as the 360 Riot Walk, a 360-degree video walking tour of the 1907 anti-Asian riots in Vancouver, Canada, among many others, and we'll touch on some of those tonight. Henry is also the Associate Professor of Art at Emily Carr University of Art and Design. Welcome, Henry. Great to see you both. I wanted to start with, I guess, a bit of background, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So we began planning both of these exhibitions many years ago now, and initially they had been exhibitions that were going to be presented separately. And as time progressed, and I'll get the first slide, please, Devin, things changed. And Cindy had a residency here in the gallery in 2019. And initially we had planned to work on a second phase in 2020, if you recall, Cindy. And then life changed quite fundamentally, of course, and we had to rethink our timelines. And of course, things have manifested this year. Next slide. And Henry and I started meeting and talking about your then new projects back in, I believe it was 2019. So much has changed or transformed since then. But we talked about Hastings Park, which began as a CBC Archives Heritage Vancouver project and evolved into a two-part exhibition, which I should just mention, a second phase or a second part to your exhibition will be realized next year this fall, a separate installation. So they were sort of operating and developing on separate tracks, and after things transformed, the world sort of changed and new developments happened, we developed these two projects together. And I'm so thrilled, and the discussion has been really quite rich between these two projects. But again, I just reiterate, they are separate exhibitions and not the same exhibition. Next slide, please, Devin. So while there are many key differences between Autumn Strawberry and Hastings Park, they do share a number of themes, such as history and archives, including family and state histories, personal and family histories, personal memories and family histories, and this connection to architecture and memory, structures in the built environment that sometimes conceal secrets and traces of histories that have been largely forgotten. Next slide, please. Both exhibitions also share an interest in experimentation with technologies of vision and representation, forms of reorientation of moving image, and mechanically reproduced image culture in an era of virtual and new immersive cinemas. And so these are very few of the themes, which I think we'll have a chance to touch on tonight. But I'm also hoping to touch and engage with, I think, the ways that these projects connect to our present moment. And so I will now just mention to our audience that we hope that you can send in your comments and questions via the social media platforms, and our gallery staff members will gather these together, and at the very end we'll have some time set aside for Q&A portion of the evening. So please, as you think of them and as they sort of come together in your mind, please send those along to our team. So the first, I guess, place that I thought we'd start, Cindy and Henry, was going back to how these projects came together. So there's been many twists and turns over the past few years. And I'm wondering if you could begin by talking about how these projects started and in both of your respective cases. And also just talk about maybe along the way, if you could touch on how the archive figures into your projects and how these projects go beyond the archive, perhaps. So it'd be great to hear more. Thank you.
Hi, I guess I'll jump in and start. I just want to give a big thank you to the Surrey Art Gallery and Jordan Strom and the entire team behind the scenes to make this possible, and also to support this work that's been in the long time making. And while I'm here, I also do want to thank my entire artistic team that's helped me build this quite a big epic project. I'm not going to name everybody, but I just want to say thank you to them as well. Can I get the first image, please? My interests in Japanese Canadian berry farming actually begins with a deep personal connection to my own grandparents, who were Japanese settlers or my great grandparents that were Japanese settlers that came over and started fishing in Eburn. And then they had my grandparents who were Nisei, my grandmother, and they started Japanese Canadian berry and raspberry farms. And in this image, you're looking at 1930s Walnut Grove, Langley. And so I've been always working through this topic or this theme, but I've never had the resources to kind of dig quite deeply into it. And so when Jordan asked me in 2019 to do a residency at the Tech Lab, just because there is such a deep connection to the Japanese Canadian farming histories with Strawberry Hill and Surrey, I thought this was the place to kind of do a more expansive, deeper research-based work. And so the Tech Lab, that was back in June, late June of 2019. And I think I came in up until the end of August. And the studio space became just an open, casual space for Nisei and Sansei individuals inside the Japanese Canadian community that had connections to berry farms. They were children that played and grew up inside these farms, and invited them to have conversations with me. Could we please have image 2? And so it began there, and I would have conversations with maybe over 20 and 30 groups of people that would come in and have conversations with me. And then I also started to collect material in the Surrey archives, and then also using and reading through and revisiting some material, some new and some old, that's already existing within the Japanese Canadian community. So there's quite a bit of material that you could find in the Nikkei Museum. And then I referred a lot to a lot of these books, Michael Hoshiko's Who's Who and Delta and Surrey. And then there are these books based out of Haney and different other smaller regions, and they have quite detailed recollection of what happened on those farms. It's difficult for me to find out information about my family's farms because my grandparents are no longer and my father's no longer, but so it's this kind of memory work that happens, and also working with seniors who were children during that time. So there's this kind of dislocation to place in memory as well, but they're remembering things, the minutia, the small things. And I think that is also paired with the larger historical context of this history. And so gathering all that material over the year, I started to imagine what kind of project it would be. And before the pandemic, there was quite an interactive element where I thought we would bring back some of these storytellers as well, but the pandemic changed that. And so it became very screen-based. I did have the idea that it would be animations, and I started to script together a 6-chapter, I guess a series of vignettes across 6 chapters. And then inside each chapter is about 15 or 20 stories based on all this material. And that became the multimedia piece, Autumn Strawberry. It's interesting because it's layered between what the Nisei as children remembered, but there's also a strong presence of the Issei generation that came in the 1900s as Japanese settlers and started these berry farms. And that information, obviously because the Issei are not alive, had to be I had to kind of sift through archival material and try to navigate that space and then combine these two things, plus also my voice from the present, kind of objectively looking down on what was happening at that time, historically, politically, and some of the hardships that they went through. So it was a real kind of combination of many things that made that work.
Thank you, Cindy. I mean, in many ways, Henry, your project sort of picks up historically on the transition to between 41 and 42 and the years immediately following those. And could you talk a little bit about how your project came together? I mentioned briefly earlier about the connection to CBC, but I know there's a deeper history there as well.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'd like to also thank, like Cindy did, to you, Jordan, and Surrey Art Gallery, the incredible support we've been given, and also acknowledge that I'm on the traditional unceded stolen territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples here in East Van. And I've been curious about my place here ever since we moved here from Hong Kong when I was really small, about this tall, and from one colonial place to another. Archives and the history have been increasingly part of my research, trying to figure out how the past influences the present, and without understanding that, we can't really move um, um, into the future without making some of the same mistakes. So in terms of the archives and 1942, I suppose, the project Hastings Park comes about because I was invited, I got this commission to do this large photograph for the CBC wall in downtown Vancouver. And that was to the Vancouver Heritage Foundation. And one of their stipulations was it had to be about Vancouver heritage and also architecture. And also it was this great opportunity to work in the archives of the CBC. So I worked with the archivist there and asked for her to bring up footage. Couldn't really make a photograph out of radio. So I was looking for imagery, and I came across interviews with Japanese Canadians who were interned, and they spoke about their experiences, especially those who decided to stay in the small towns in southeastern BC. And I thought that was really interesting, and also it triggered my association with Hastings Park. And my association with Hastings Park is partly there's a lot of ambivalence there because I grew up in Vancouver, enjoying the PNE, and also going to exhibition parks. My dad was a gambler and he loved to bet on the horses, so I got dragged there a lot and spent a lot of time there. But I didn't know about the Japanese Canadians who were temporarily housed there in 1942 until later in life. And when I found out, I went, how come I didn't know about this? I mean, I grew up here, I went to school here. Why is this missing from the education system? Why am I not aware of this? Who else doesn't know this? So I wanted to create some kind of investigation of that history. But I also, anyways, one reference in my research was Leonard Frank's photographs. And Leonard Frank was an important local photographer who documented a lot of the growth of Vancouver for decades. He came out of retirement to take on this commission to document the Japanese Canadians who moved into Hastings Park and then were boarded on trains to be interned throughout British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, Ontario, I believe, in internment and labor camps. So I didn't want to replicate those photographs, but I wanted to be aware of them. I went to the Nikkei Museum, I talked to Lena Reed and looked at their photographs by Leonard Frank and so forth. And then I needed to figure out, oh, I'm sorry, are we on just me or are we on the first image? Are we on the first image?
Yeah, we should have the first image up now.
Okay, thank you. So there's a picture of the PNE on the top left, and you know there's little baby pig races inside, and the cows and so forth. That's a livestock building, the big long red building, and directly below is exhibit Hastings Park in 1942, with each of the buildings with a different designation. It was um, um, taken over by the BC Security Commission through the War Measures Act, and each of these buildings had a different purpose, and it was overseen by the RCMP. And the two black and white photographs are of Leonard Frank. One is of the livestock building, where women and children were placed in the cattle stalls with the stench of the feces from the animals very prevalent. And the other one's a hockey rink. And those are actually bunk beds. They really used every square inch they could. And the men were placed in there. So can I have the next slide, please? And so the image that I created was of the livestock building, and here it is being installed on the CBC exterior wall. I ended up using an infrared camera, a thermal imaging camera that the construction industry has developed to analyze differences in temperature, looking for leaks or water staining behind walls and so forth. And I'll talk about that more later, but that's the origins of this piece.
Great, thank you, Henry. I thought actually maybe we could shift a little bit towards thinking about picture-making technologies, because I know this is such a really interesting aspect of your work, and I think so integral to what you do, is looking at moving images and video these days. We're just overwhelmed with screens in many ways, and of all scales, and in our public spaces, in our private lives. And in both of your multimedia installations, you play with multiple screens, often at different scales, and you are in different ways taking standardized technologies, off-the-shelf technologies, projectors, tablets, screens, and pushing them outside of their normal use. So I was wondering if you could both talk about your approach to moving images and technologies in your respective projects, and maybe how that fits in with your larger practice.
Sure, I can start with that. Could I get image 3, please? So Autumn Strawberry is made via, there must be 6 different types of screens, but my interest actually in media arts and moving images stems also from the fact that within my personal history, within Japanese Canadian history, cameras and radios were confiscated inside the camps. And so for me, doing research around that kind of history, I'm basically trying to re-image something that has no pictures. And oftentimes the research material, the photographs that are surfaced or are readily available to the public are government sanctioned photography. And so it's, I'm mostly interested oftentimes inside this new kind of cinema making or producing new pictures. And so animation as a medium counters the photography in the sense it's a hand-drawn medium. It has a fantastical quality to kind of transform or bend or tell stories that are difficult to see and also difficult to re-witness again. And so I've been interested in this idea that when I bring the images back again that I've reimagined and sometimes borrow from what is available, that they exist on sort of multiple portals or different kind of platforms that allow audiences to kind of enter and experience the work. I'm not interested in repurposing the whole history again in a linear, factual way, but sometimes sustaining or holding or looping a moment. I think oftentimes, when you do the memory work or when you talk about something, we're not necessarily remembering the dates or the specificities of things, especially if you were a child during that time. And so I'm deeply conscious of that history and how sort of that severed also the remembrances of the time before that. And so say for the conjuring of material or gathering of material of Autumn Strawberry that takes place in the 1900s, just before the internment. I think it's important when the images come back that they're situated and they live in this other kind of tactile way that kind of tries to replicate or reproduce his memory. In other previous works that I've made, this sort of minute or the kind of miniature is also significant, also because of the seniors that work with me. You know, it comes down to a child's eye, or like it comes down to something very small, and I'm not interested in kind of producing this kind of grand narrative around it. So there's a kind of care that goes into how the images get seen again. And oftentimes inside the kind of composing of the telling of these stories, again, I protect certain things also as well, or I kind of shield some things, heighten some things. And so I think, yeah, I'm interested in how we use screens in that way, which is so different from now. I mean, we can take an iPhone and snap all our meals, and we have all the capacity through these small devices to capture things. So it's a really different time. But I think I'm trying to be very, I guess, being very aware of how they come back into the space, and what that experience is for the viewer to re-enter them.
Were there some images that you wanted to point out where that happens, or did we cover
Well,
that?
in this one, in image 3, this is basically a shot of autumn strawberry, but you're getting the image of Japan has bombed Pearl Harbor. You're getting a newsprint over the scrim. You're also getting images of Japanese Canadians waiting to board the train and leaving, and then farmers moving in tandem in the room. So there's a kind of layering that happens. And also you don't necessarily have to land on a specific space. Also, you're experiencing it through as your physical body moves through the space.
Thank you. So I wanted to move on to another question. I guess it ties in with a subject that both of you touched on.
Jordan,
earlier.
am I supposed to answer that too?
Oh, I'm sorry, Henry. Yes, of course. I'm getting, yes, if you could please answer that, that'd be wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, that'd be great. So Cindy, you mentioned that you're interested in histories that are difficult to see, and I'm also interested in that as well. For this project, literally the thermal imaging camera that I was using can see things that are in plain sight, but we don't have access to the near infrared spectrum with our eyeballs. And so these cameras, I was basically using it as a medium to try to conjure the past, to see what's beneath the surface, beneath whatever paint jobs and patches and weathering. And it's not like I could ask it specifically, what do you remember the time when all these Japanese Canadians were shoved inside of you? But rather more like what can you show beneath what I can't see? So it's this kind of speculative imaging in many ways, and then how to show that imagery. So I wanted to actually show some of this through infrared light, and so there's this invisible projection in the dark room. There's 2 galleries where the Hastings Park is shown, and for the invisible projection, how do you project invisibly and then make us humans be able to see it? So can we have the first slide, slide 3, please? So here's an image of a viewer looking at a monitor that has a infrared camera looking at the viewer, and directly behind the viewer, there is a screen. And on that screen, can we have the next slide, please? Slide 4. On that screen is, a special screen made with sort of like a plexiglass that only allows near infrared light to go through. And sandwiched inside is a sheet of something, a substrate, that catches that infrared light so that the camera can then see it. and it appears behind you as you look at the monitor, and you can see yourself. And it's kind of like a rear view mirror in a way. You can see the past, and the images are stills from video that I shot with that camera, as if they were, say, surveillance cameras set up outside of each of the entrances of the 4 remaining buildings from 1942 at Hastings Park. As if, you know, there's, and the image, the videos are scanning the site and looking behind bushes and trying to see if someone's hiding after curfew or trying to escape from Hastings Park. And so, yeah, this is a different kind of technology, infrared technology. And can we run the video? Is that okay? It's just 1 minute. Can we run the video now? Infrared technology is used on your iPhones, for instance, for facial recognition. And so it's all around us these days. It's, you know, it scans your bank card as you put it into your ATM. This video that's showing right now, it says it's a walkthrough of the space. There's a slide projector going kalunk kalunk, and it's projecting onto the screen in the middle of the space. And as you walk in, you can see the image only on the monitor. If you turn around and look at the screen, you're not going to see anything because you don't have the ability to see infrared unless you are really, really, really special.
Great, thanks, Henry. So I wanted to shift to something that both of you touched on, and this comes back to technology in some way, but it really relates to more history, and that is that both of your art practices have returned repeatedly to history. And one of the historical themes that you've both tackled is histories of racialized violence and anti-Asian racism in your works, both directly and more obliquely in different ways. And Henry, I'm thinking of your projects such as the 360 Riot Walk of 2019 and Riot Food Here from 2018. And Cindy, I mean, there's so many different works, but I'm thinking of a project that actually started my thinking about this project in many ways for me in the conversation, you might recall many years ago, was the Confections project at Center A, and in 2012, which looked at stores and confection shops in Powell Street area and their mass disappearance. So I'm wondering what can art express about these moments of violence that straight documentary or capital H history can't?
Do you want to go first again, Cindy? My turn, go first? Okay. Well, I guess the straight up documentary history question, I mean, those are sort of official histories, even if they're interrogating. You know, an official history is still in relationship to official histories. The 360 Riot Walk and Riot Food Here, 360 Riot Walk came out of, developed out of Riot Food Here, and Riot Food Here. Can we have the first slide number 5, please? Riot Food Here was a pop-up meal, basically offering food from 5 different cultural perspectives that commemorated the 1907 anti-Asian riots organized by the Asiatic Exclusion League, asking the question, what would you have eaten as an angry white man just before you go out to attack the Chinese and the Japanese? What would you have eaten as a Chinese person in Chinatown or a Japanese person in Parugai area before the angry white man came to attack you? Or if you were Punjabi, watching them attack you, attack these other Asians after you got beat up in forced march to the border from Bellingham 3 days prior, or if you're an indigenous person, these angry white men attacking all these other people on your land. So to start off with a walking tour by Michael Barnholden, who wrote the book Reading the Riot Act, A Brief History of Riots in Vancouver. And during that walk, I was thinking, well, it'd be so great to have this walking tour kind of on demand whenever you wanted it. And what if it was an immersive 360 interactive experience? So that's how that came out. And in some ways, both of these projects are a response to my wondering, what would my life have had been like, my family's life had been like if we had come earlier, before 1968? 67 was when Canada changed the Immigration Act, so it wasn't so racially biased. And, you know, would we have had to confront the racism that was so prevalent and overt earlier on? Of course, we wouldn't have been able to come anyways during the Chinese Exclusion Act for 23 years, unless you're a diplomat or a scholar, and that was the only exception. And we're still living with a legacy today of Vancouver's and British Columbia's and Canada's racist history. So, and it's not just being Chinese, you get the racism. So yeah, these projects come out of that, and they're a way to explore that through dialogue, through conversation, and through embodied experience.
Thank you. Thanks, Henry. Cindy?
Yeah, just to add to that, maybe thinking about the embodied experience, could I get image 4 up, please? So Jordan, you brought up the exhibition To and From, which was curated by Makiko Hara and Annabelle Vaughn, which is a group exhibition back in 2012. And thinking about what art can do that the capital H documentary can't do, this is an example of a project that what we're looking at is a confectionery stand on an old Japanese wooden staircase. And for this project, I was thinking about, I think there was about 15 to 19 Japanese confectionery stores along Powell before the internment that were confiscated from the government during the internment and never returned back. And I was interested in this idea of taste and thinking about food and memory and reimagining the geography of that place via the things that you remembered through food. And again, worked with a small group of Nisei elders to remember when they were kids what they ate in that neighborhood. What they remembered going to pick up was the best mochi down the street here, or the best ginger these sweet red ginger candies. And then ended up working with seniors from Tonarigumi when they allowed me to have the privilege to join their group to make these sweets, but started to create these candies and then brought them back into the space. And I think art has that capacity for us to kind of transform very difficult knowledge and difficult content, and to have the audiences come in and witness them, and for them to do the actions of remembering. In this installation, audience members were allowed to line up, and they sort of re-performed this kind of staging of lining up to buy candy that had gone through these different processes with me of having conversations with elders, making them, and then bringing them back to the space. And it isn't about me going to the elders and trying to pull, stories that are difficult. I'm not interested in that kind of extraction or that kind of process of working with them, because art also has this capacity to produce very generative healing aspects inside the community work that I do. And so in that sense, this work, I think, was interesting for me because the space became a performance site for everybody else to come in to do the work, rather than it be on these seniors that I'm interviewing. So I think I think that counters what the capital H documentary kind of work would do.
Great, thank you, Cindy. Henry, you mentioned that the food was prepared by Chris Barnholden from the Riot Food Here project, which is an important part of that. I mean, these projects are so rich, and it really sort of shows the different types of mediums and not traditional sort of mediums that you're working with, and this connection to food that's so important to both of your works. I'm just conscious of time as we're coming up here. I do want to just ask though, Henry, just a question that's more directed to you, but perhaps Cindy has some thoughts on this as well, It's just something that came up in our discussions around this project is, in recent years, there's been a return in many ways to discussions that were very, very live and very important in the 1990s and the late 80s, was the sort of around who has the right to speak on certain subjects. And these have been very important discussions to have right now. And I think about your work, Henry, in terms of how you not only are addressing the stories of your own family backgrounds or your own lived experience, but how to, as an artist, approach the stories of others. And here you're working with histories related to Japanese Canadians, and artists are always thinking about and trying to think outside of their own experiences. And I wanted to see if you could maybe talk a little bit about that and your approach in this project for a minute or two here.
Yeah, I'll try to keep it brief, but this is such a huge topic, the topic of appropriation or cultural appropriation specifically. And of course, I'm nervous when the subject matter is something, like internment. It's a sensitive, fraught subject. There's so much trauma involved. I don't want in any way to represent that experience. I'm trying to be as clear as I can be to approach this topic through basically an outsider's perspective. To be, but see, like, one of the big questions around any sort of representation is, what's your stake in it? What's your subject position? Do you have the authority to speak about this? And certainly I don't have the authority from lived experience to speak about this. In the same way, I don't have authorities to speak about the Chinese head tax, because my family didn't experience that. And by extension, being Chinese, do I have more right than somebody else? So, there are some people who have very strong opinions about this with different positions. Your lived experience gives you an authority because it's what you experience, is what you know. And that's going to be a different kind of approach than I'm interested in giving. This is all part of the history of this place where I get to call my home. I have the honor, the privilege on the backs of a very violent history, and also this is I'm invested in this place, and I think we need to know more about it. I think we need to raise awareness, and I think we have to complicate some of these histories. So I think there's ways to go about and approaches that, you do the work, you try to be respectful, you consult, and all these processes are still being developed as we go. There's no formula, but there are protocols, and those protocols keep on being developed. So yeah, I hope I'm not too vague here, but I think we all have something at stake in each other's experiences and each other's histories. But you can't speak for somebody else. Cindy, you want to say something? I'm curious to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think, even inside this work that I do within my own community, I think that the state, there's, because essentially I'm working with material, oral history stories from people, and they're not even, they're connected to my experience, but I have to be essentially ethically mindful, because I'm in a position of power to bring them back into an art form. And so there's always a kind of negotiation that happens, and a kind of thinking through, an aesthetics versus ethics kind of conversation that happens. And for me, it's easy for me to say it's because it's my lived experience that I can speak about these things. But I also feel, as especially in these last years moving forward, when some of the work bumps up against other histories, to acknowledge that Japanese Canadians were also settlers on land that didn't belong to them. Also, there's all these other interweavings of stuff happens. And I think moving forward for me as an artist, I want to be also mindful. I also want to complicate the histories and complicate the relationships and the storytelling inside the work as well. So moving forward, I think these are things that these are big questions that I'm thinking about as well.
Great, thank you for those thoughtful answers. I mean, it is a huge subject, and don't want to minimize it at all. But that's really important food for thought. I think I know I had a couple other questions that I wanted to ask you, but I do know that we've entered into the time of the night when we're going to invite some questions from the audience. But there might be a chance to circle back to a couple of the questions that I still have remaining. But I've got a question here from Laureen Oikawa. And Laureen says that she was fortunate to see the exhibitions. She appreciated, Cindy, the details in your work and the attention to the minutiae in the memories of Japanese Canadian elders. And she watched your images and saw them again a second time. And she was wondering if were there details that relate to your own family story that you might want to highlight as part of the piece?
Sure. There's a couple of vignettes or scenes inside Autumn Strawberry that are actually taken from conversations with my dad's sisters. So my aunts that are, in their 80s and sharp as little bats. And there's a story inside there. I mean, when I asked them about their berry farm experience, they were like 3 or 4. And so there's one aunt in great detail described a bullfrog that was boiled in the well water. And that was the entire interview, was, having a bath and having this bullfrog be boiled. And so there's details like that. There's also quite a big moment towards the end of the animation where, and this is something my father also told me, but my aunts also remember, is when they knew that they were going to be going to the internment camp, the farmers came out with their Kodak brownies or their cameras, and they started to burn them into a big bonfire. So there is towards the end of Autumn Strawberry, there's an animation sequence where the farmers are taking a Kodak brownie and, burning it essentially because they couldn't bring it with them to camp. So those two are stories from my own family history.
Great. And there's a question here also from Lorraine for you, Henry. Lorraine says, as a 4th generation Japanese Canadian on my mother's side of the family, we were held in Hastings Park before being sent to internment camps. As many families who are based outside of Vancouver in the Fraser Valley at such places as Surrey and Langley and further up the valley. I grew up going to the PNE and never knew my family story. And it feels like the colors are emanating the memories of Japanese Canadians who once lived there, says Lorraine. But she says, the food was vile at Hastings Park. Elders tell me about the worms in the meat and people getting sick. Could you speak to that comment from Lorraine?
Yeah, it's interesting that it brings up your question for Cindy and myself, question F in the list, about aesthetics, right? So maybe it's an opportunity for Cindy and me to talk about aesthetics here a little bit. Yeah, so Lorraine, these vivid colors seem kind of joyful and kind of psychedelic, huh? And that does actually fit with a bit of the PNE's history, but certainly not with the topic at hand, especially given the title of all the artworks and the references and so forth. So I think in terms of the aesthetics and the kind of visual kind of impact, I'm hoping that it operates on a visceral level, but perhaps also operating on a visceral level is either the lived experience or the association of that lived experience of the trauma of being stationed at Hastings Park and having that site as a place where it was part of the demonization of the Japanese Canadians during World War II. It was part of the incarceration process for the Japanese Canadians during World War II. And so, how does one reconcile the aesthetics, in this case, kind of like pumped up to the extreme with all those intense colors, with that knowledge? And I'm hoping that there's a tension that's being created between the two. It's there. I don't think these images really can be seen as sentimental, so I'm not falling to that trap. That are these images making fun of that era and that time? I'm hoping not. I think I like staring at these images. They're pretty. There's a lot of like aesthetic value to them, but at the same time, I know that it's there's a horrific kind of experiences that happen within. So, and I think that contradiction. I'm hoping that contradiction is an aesthetic strategy that's coming across for some people.
Thank you, Henry. And on that note, Cindy, did you want to mention, I mean, you're also dealing with some very sort of, very challenging, the hardship on the farms, moments of violent eruption against physical and constant barrage of verbal, just violence that's going on. But many of your works are just, they have a kind of beauty and quality of elegance and sort of childlike playfulness. How do you reconcile those things in your work?
Yeah, I think similar to Henry, there's obviously a tension between beauty and horror, and I think especially for Autumn Strawberry, there is the aesthetic or the look of how we know and see the internment, or how we understand racialized violence in the media, and what are the pictures for that. And in Autumn Strawberry, through the research, I also wanted to capture the resilience of the Issei, and this kind of that they were able to keep and sustain families going despite hardships. And they really had this kind of, these were people that were born in the Meiji period. So they did have a kind of samurai spirit, this kind of pride, despite all the things that were happening. So there is a kind of care, and there's a kind of, I think for me, I needed to insert a kind of levity for me as the maker to move through this narrative again, and to see these things again, to hear these things again. There has to be some place of joy, or there has to be some, because it's almost like an endurance. It's a long-term, process and work for me. And so whether, I'm not sure if it's beauty as per se, but attentiveness or a care, I think produces this aesthetic. And that's juxtaposed with, say, Nancy Tam's sound, or the looming dangers of the internment. So I'm sometimes it's intentional, and sometimes it's not, but I think it's about kind of bringing forward that a kind of levity inside the work, for also, I think, for audiences to enter into the space as well too.
Great, thank you. I have another question here. Actually, this comes back to you, Henry. A question from Kirsten McAllister. And she mentions a photographer by the name of Richard Mose, who uses infrared military cameras, and just thinking about being conscious of the invasive, aggressive forms of vision and surveillance that's at work with these kind of technologies and this type of photography. Could you talk a little bit more about the use of these technologies of surveillance and their connection to the military and violence, and how you think about that?
For sure. I mean, infrared technology, imaging technology, was developed by the U.S. military, I think during the Korean War, or somewhere around there, so in the 50s. And nowadays it's used a lot by law enforcement, especially when they're trying to find a fugitive who's hiding. Drones will have that. Hunters will use it for killing animals at night. And actually, automated self-driving cars are using it, because it can see way further, and it can see through smoke and fog and so forth. So this technology is literally invasive, and I'm, for me, there's associations with the way that the RCMP, they were the ones who oversaw the compound that became a compound, Hastings Park, in 1942, and I'm sort of like mimicking some of the the potential images that they would have installed, they would have created if they had installed some of those home security cameras that you can buy at Home Depot nowadays. So yeah, definitely aggressive, especially since it's the intention is for these cameras to go beyond what we can perceive, and oftentimes either use it as evidence or um, to for control of some sort, like spatial control.
Great, thanks, Henry. I just have time now or we have time now for just about one or two more questions. And I have a question here from Juliana Okay. She says, considering aesthetics and ethics, was there any point in the creative process for either of your projects where the research was overwhelming? Thinking of regarding the sensitivity of the internment topic and all of the really heavy material that you're dealing with. Could you speak to that question from Juliana?
Maybe I can speak to that. So I've been doing a couple of different projects. Rock, Paper, Scissors is another one in 2017 where it's research-based, and there is this open invitation for people to come forward at their own will to kind of share stories. And both in Autumn Strawberry and in Rock, Paper, Scissors, even after the project has closed, I will still get a flood of emails or letters or messages about their experiences. Some of them, about, racism as a child growing up in these places, and just lots of correspondence. And it gets overwhelming but I'm also quite, I also feel very privileged and honored that these strangers are coming forward to send, to leave these stories with me. And to be sort of like, and, integrated into your work, or do, you can do as you will. But for many of them, I think it was for me that I didn't include them. It was just meant to be something that was released for them, for me to read and left. And so there are some choices that I make in this process now. This is the second kind of work like this where, and I still get, it continues this process of like, and I wonder if it's just because the history of violence and the history of this racism still has this affect over years, and it could take, years later going forward, something might trigger something to come out or to come up. And and so it's overwhelming. And I think as an artist, that is in itself is another thing that's happening inside the making of this work. That's not about exhibitions. It's not about a finished project. It's just about maybe for me, it's the repair or restorative work that's happening. That is the power of art, I think. I don't know if I answered that, but.
I think for Hastings Park, because I mean, okay, so the photographs by Leonard Frank, it's so interesting, the objective eye that he employs in documenting the lineup of the men during during a meal, or women washing with their little kids around in the laundry room. I mean, Grace Thompson's curated a show of his work and compared it, placed it side by side with Bill Jeffries' images of Ansel Adams down at the Japanese American National Museum in LA, right? That show, I mean, whereas Ansel Adams are kind of schmaltzy and sentimental, and it's really quite interesting how you get access to the direct lived experiences in very different ways. With my project, it's even further removed, not just because of time, but I suppose it's more of a reference rather than a direct representation. So I'm kind of like scratching the surface in a sense, or and to see, you know, where 1942 might show up. And that's my goal, but I'm pretty sure I'm not getting it, because it's not like I can set on the thermal imaging camera 1942 like some kind of time machine. But if that's the purpose, it brings to light, hopefully, infrared light, um, that particular experience. And it is, I mean, it is really overwhelming as a history, and I'm not unaware of that. But yeah, it's definitely, if in some way, um, trying to just peel back some layers. I did something kind of similar a long time ago. I was in Beijing in 1989 in December, and I took pictures of the paving stones around Tiananmen Square. And this is when it was under martial law, and the military were doing drills around it. And I took pictures looking for evidence, residue of the massacre from June 4th. And I kind of did something similar at the Oka Golf Course too, and because I was a couple of years after. So I've got this kind of interest in looking at surfaces and seeing and asking those surfaces, like, what's just underneath you? You know, like, if you could talk, what would you say?
Thank you for both those responses. I mean, it is such, you know, such difficult material in so many ways, and you've approached these very challenging subjects, and that's what, you know, that's what artists do, and many artists do, and not all, and nor do they all have to, but you choose to really look directly at in different ways in many of your works these very traumatic moments and violent moments. But so much beauty and strength and resilience do come through your choices of how you compose those images. And in many ways, we become so desensitized as viewers to modern media, and your work is really a testament to how it can be done in a very powerful way. And but it does, you know, there's a labor there, and it must take a toll in many ways. And how much do you let in, and how do you sort of keep going on with that work? So thank you so much. I mean, I think we're going to have to wrap this up now, because we're just past time. And so there was so much more that I would have loved to have talked with you about. But I do think it's always good to leave many loose ends, and I'm really hoping that everybody will get a chance to come down and see this work who haven't already. So I just wanted to end with a couple thank yous and acknowledgements. And first and foremost, both of you, thank you for your work, all of the work you put into these very complex and enlivening exhibitions. And I also want to acknowledge some of the people who helped make tonight come together. Our extraordinary team here at the gallery. I want to thank Cecily Nicholson, our event coordinator, Savi Baines and Alana Edwards, who helped to support this event and make it all happen over the last many weeks as we prepared for it. I want to thank our esteemed director, Alison Raja, and I want to thank our technician, Devin Scott, at the controls. I want to also acknowledge our funders, the Canada Council for the Arts and the BC Arts Council and City of Surrey. I want to thank especially everybody who took the time out to join this conversation and take it in, and it's, you know, it's so essential for these discussions, and we really appreciate all of the different competing things that are going on, and all the summer activities that one can take in. So we're grateful for your attendance and your interest. And we hope that all of you will have a chance to come down and see the exhibitions if you haven't already, or if you have, come back and take them in. There's so much to see. And every time you take these in, I found, and certainly I've heard from others, you'll see them in a different way again. So Please visit the website if you are interested in visiting to register for a visit. We appreciate if you register in advance and come down and check out the exhibitions before they wrap up on August 28th. So thank you all, and we hope to see you all again soon. Thank you.